She was 78 years old, and she walked into the wrong restaurant. Every man inside knew it the moment the door opened, not because she was frail, not because she was old, but because women like her, women who pressed their dresses before leaving the house, who gripped their canes with both hands and still held their chins level, did not come to places like this unless something had already gone terribly wrong. The room didn't move. It didn't need to. In a restaurant where Marco Ferri ate his Tuesday dinners, stillness was its own kind of language, and every man there was fluent. She walked past the first table, then the second, then the third. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke. They just watched, the way men watch things they don't yet understand but recognize as significant. She stopped at the back booth. She sat down, and Marco Ferri, who had not been surprised by anything in over 2 decades, looked at the woman across from him and felt something shift behind his ribs that he couldn't immediately name. What happened in the next 10 minutes would set in motion something that the city of San Corvo had been building toward for years. A reckoning buried under badges and briefcases, and the comfortable assumption that some people's suffering was simply too inconvenient to investigate. And when it finally broke open, it wouldn't just destroy one man's career. It would expose an entire system that had learned to profit from silence, and the frail old woman who had walked into the wrong restaurant would turn out to be the only person brave enough to threaten it. Her name was Rosa Mancini, and she moved like someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times and was terrified it still wouldn't be enough. The cane was cedar wood, worn smooth at the handle. Her coat was buttoned despite the warmth of the room. Her shoes were old but clean, the kind of clean that takes effort, the kind of effort that speaks to dignity maintained under pressure. She carried a small leather purse, and when she opened it, her fingers didn't shake from age. They shook from 11 days of holding everything together alone. Marco noticed all of it. He noticed the way she scanned the room before she sat, not with fear, but with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned to measure exits. He noticed the way she touched the purse after setting it down, checking it, reassuring herself. He noticed the hollows under her eyes, and the kind that come not from one bad night but from 11 of them stacked end to end. He noticed the photograph she placed on the table between them. A young woman, dark-haired, mid-30s, smiling in the uncomplicated way people smile when they don't know they're being watched. Standing outside an office building on the city's east side, alive and unaware and gone. Marco looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at Rosa. She didn't flinch. Most people who sat across from Marco Ferri flinched. It wasn't something he cultivated deliberately. It was simply the accumulated weight of who he was and what he'd done and what everyone in the room always understood without being told. But Rosa Mancini looked at him the way someone looks at a locked door when they've already decided they're going through it one way or another. "My granddaughter," she said. 11 days. Marco said nothing. The police closed the case in 4, said she left on her own, said she had a history. A pause, brief and precise as a cut. She had a history because of what was done to her, not because of who she was. Marco had heard 1,000 versions of this kind of ask, from men who owed debts, from rivals who needed buffer, from people who wanted things handled without paperwork. He had never heard it from a 78-year-old woman with pressed clothes and cedar cane who looked at him like she had already made her peace with sitting in this chair. "I know what you are," Rosa said. "I'm not asking you to be something else. I'm asking you to find Julia before whoever has her decides she's more trouble than she's worth." The table held its silence. And then Marco Ferri, who had built his entire life on the principle that sentiment was a liability, reached across the white tablecloth and covered Rosa Mancini's shaking hands with his tattooed ones. She broke then. Not dramatically, not with sobs. Just a single sharp exhale, the kind that happens when a person has been holding their breath for 11 days and someone finally tells them they can stop. She wasn't crying because she was afraid of him. She was crying because he was the first person in 11 days who had looked at her like Julia's life was worth something. Marco didn't make promises. He had learned long ago that promises were spent too easily and cost too much when they came due. Instead, he turned to Sal, his lieutenant, his shadow, to the man who had been standing 3 feet behind his left shoulder for 15 years, and said 4 words. Find out who knows. In San Corvo, those 4 words moved like current through water, quiet, invisible, and unstoppable. What they surfaced in the next 72 hours would make everyone involved wish Rosa Mancini had walked into a different restaurant. Because the men who took Julia hadn't just made an enemy of a grieving grandmother. They had made an enemy of the one man in the city with both the means and the motive to dismantle everything they'd spent years carefully building. But to understand what Marco found, you first have to understand who Julia was, and why she was taken, and why 11 days had already passed without a single person in authority lifting a finger to find her. Rosa had not always been a woman who walked into rooms like that. She had not always been a woman who had to. For most of her life, she had been exactly what she appeared to be: a grandmother, a widow, a woman of quiet faith and deep routine, the kind of woman the city overlooked entirely, and that, it turned out, was the most dangerous thing about her. Because when you underestimate someone like Rosa Mancini, you make the mistake of assuming that frailty and patience are the same thing. They are not. Rosa had been patient for 11 days. She was done being patient. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, welcome. We tell stories like this one, stories about unlikely people making impossible choices, stories the algorithm doesn't always want you to find. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's find out together what Marco Ferri does next. Because Rosa Mancini didn't walk through that door for nothing. Rosa had not always been a woman who walked into rooms like that. For most of her life, she had been exactly what she appeared to be: a grandmother, a widow, a woman of quiet faith and deep routine. She rose at 6. She made coffee strong enough to offend. She kept a garden in the back that her neighbors pretended not to envy, and she attended Sunday Mass not out of obligation, but out of genuine conversation with something she believed was listening. She had not always had to fight for anything. But then her daughter Kara died at 34, a fast illness, the kind that doesn't negotiate, and left behind a 7-year-old girl with dark eyes and no patience for being told what she couldn't do. Rosa took Julia in without discussion, without paperwork delays, without a single moment of hesitation. She simply made up the small bedroom at the end of the hall, put fresh flowers on the windowsill, and said, "This is your home now." Julia had not made it easy. She was angry the way children are angry when the world has already taken something fundamental from them, loudly, sideways, at the wrong people. She pushed. Rosa held. Julia pushed harder. Rosa held harder. And somewhere in that stubbornness, a different kind of love grew. Not soft, not simple. The kind that gets forged, not given. By 30, Julia had become someone Rosa could only partially take credit for, as she had survived things that would have flattened a lesser person. Years that Rosa knew only in outline because Julia protected her grandmother the same way Rosa had once protected her. She had built something steady, a job she was proud of, a small apartment on the East Side, a life that was finally, genuinely hers. The last normal day was a Sunday. Julia had come for dinner. Rosa made the red sauce that took 4 hours because Julia said once, years ago, that it tasted like being safe, and Rosa had never made it any other way since. They ate too much. They argued briefly about something that didn't matter. Julia helped with the dishes, kissed Rosa on the cheek at the door, and said she'd call Tuesday. She called Tuesday. The conversation was short. Julia sounded distracted, a little tired. Or the way she sounded when something was sitting on her mind that she hadn't decided how to carry yet. Rosa noticed. She didn't push. She thought, I'll ask next time. There was no next time. Wednesday came and went. Thursday. By Friday, Rosa was calling back. By Saturday, she was at the apartment building talking to a neighbor who hadn't seen Julia since Monday. By Sunday, she was at the police station, sitting across from an officer who typed slowly and asked questions that felt more like formalities than investigation. She's an adult. Adults leave. Rosa told him about the distracted phone call, about the fact that Julia's car was still in the parking garage 2 blocks from her building, about the neighbor who said the lights in Julia's apartment hadn't changed in 4 days. The officer typed it all down, and then he thanked her for coming in. The case was closed 4 days later. Insufficient evidence of foul play. Subject has prior history of... Rosa stopped reading after that sentence. She knew what the word history meant when institutions used it. It meant, we have already decided this person is not worth the full weight of our attention. It meant, find somewhere else to bring your grief. So she did. She went to the precinct captain. She was polite. The captain was sympathetic in the careful, practiced way of someone who has learned to seem concerned without committing to anything. She went to a city councilman whose office manager told her someone would follow up. No one followed up. She went to a legal aid office, a journalist who covered city corruption, and a victims' advocacy group that was underfunded and overwhelmed and genuinely sorry they couldn't do more. 11 days, 11 doors, every one of them closed. Rosa was not desperate when she walked into Marco Ferri's restaurant. She was not unraveling. She was not a woman at the end of her rope. She was a woman who had methodically exhausted every sanctioned option available to her and made a clear-eyed decision about what came next. She had done the math. She had counted the cost, and she had pressed her dress, gripped her cane, and walked through the one door nobody expected her to open. Because Julia had not survived everything she survived just to disappear into a closed case file. Rosa was going to make sure of it. People who didn't know Marco Ferri assumed they did. They assumed because of the restaurant, and because of the men who stood near doorways without being asked, because of the way conversations shifted when he entered a room. They built a picture from the visible pieces and told themselves they understood the whole. It was a comfortable mistake. Marco had never done anything to correct it. The truth was less cinematic and more complicated. He had grown up 3 miles from the restaurant he now owned, in a neighborhood the city invested in only when it needed a cautionary tale. His father worked the docks. His mother cleaned offices in buildings where the people inside never learned her name. Marco had watched them spend themselves down to nothing for a system that returned nothing, and he had decided early that he would find a different arrangement. He had. The arrangement had costs he hadn't fully calculated at 22. By 30, he understood them. By 40, he had stopped pretending they could be undone. What people didn't assume about Marco Ferri, what the picture they built from visible pieces never included, was the code. Not the romanticized version. Not loyalty to family above all. Not honor among thieves. Not the mythology that movies had constructed around men like him. Something quieter and more specific than that. He did not touch children. He did not touch people who had nothing. And he did not look away from suffering that he had the means to address, because he had done that once, early, when he was still young enough to believe that staying out of something was the same as staying clean. A woman in his neighborhood, a situation he recognized and chose not to enter. He had told himself it wasn't his business. She didn't survive the winter. Marco had carried that specific weight for 30 years. It had shaped every decision since in ways he couldn't always articulate, but never stopped feeling. So when Rosa Mancini's hands had shaken over her granddaughter's photograph, he hadn't needed to deliberate. The decision had already been made decades ago by a younger version of himself, standing at a window, choosing not to act. He wasn't going to stand at that window again. After Rosa left, Marco sat alone in the booth for several minutes. Sal waited. He knew better than to interrupt Marco's silences, which were not empty but occupied. full of the kind of thinking that happened below language, in the place where pattern recognition lived. When Marco finally spoke, he didn't look up from the photograph Rosa had left behind. She worked in the city planning office, he said, our East Side division. Sal confirmed it. He'd already looked at what Rosa had told them. Pull everything on that office, permits, contracts, anything that moved in the last 18 months. Marco set the photograph down carefully, like it was something that deserved care. And find out which detective closed the case. I want to know who he had lunch with the week he made that decision. Sal nodded and was gone. Marco looked at the photograph a moment longer. He had been in this city for 54 years. He knew its architecture the way a doctor knows a body, not just the visible surface, but the systems underneath, where things flowed and where they blocked, where pressure accumulated and where it was quietly bled off before anyone noticed. He knew which parts of the city worked and which parts only appeared to work. And he knew the difference between disorganization and design. Julia's case had the feel of design. A missing persons report closed in 4 days. A detective who stopped returning the grandmother's calls. A narrative built around the word history. Deployed fast, deployed clean, like someone had prepared it in advance. These were not the fingerprints of bureaucratic indifference. Bureaucratic indifference was slower, sloppier, more accidental in its cruelty. This was something else. Someone had wanted that case closed. Someone with enough reach to close it quickly and enough intelligence to make it look routine. Which meant Julia hadn't simply been taken. She had been specifically, deliberately silenced. Which meant she had seen something. Marco picked up his coffee. It had gone cold while Rosa was talking. He drank it anyway. "What did you find?" he said quietly to the photograph. "And who decided you couldn't keep it?" The restaurant hummed around him. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent and unknowing, the way cities always do when something is about to break open inside them. Sal was already moving. The machinery was already turning. And somewhere in San Corvo, the men who had taken Julia Mancini were about to discover that the closed case file they had purchased was worth considerably less than they had paid for it. Sal Benedetto had worked for Marco Ferri for 15 years, and in that time he had learned one reliable truth about cities. They forgot nothing. People forgot. Institutions forgot. Police reports got filed and misplaced and quietly buried. But cities, the physical infrastructure of them, the loading dock workers and parking attendants and overnight security guards and delivery drivers who moved through them at hours when respectable people were asleep. Cities remembered everything. You just had to know who to ask. Sal knew who to ask. Within 6 hours of leaving the restaurant, he had placed 11 calls and made 4 stops. By midnight, he had a working timeline of Julia Mancini's last confirmed movements. By the following morning, he was sitting across from Marco with a legal pad covered in tight economical notes and a look on his face that meant what he'd found was worse than expected. Marco poured coffee and waited. "She didn't leave," Sal said. "She was taken. Monday evening between 7 and 7:40. Parking garage on Clement Street, 2 blocks from her building. The garage had 3 cameras. One at the entrance, one at the stairwell, one covering the lower level where Julia's car was registered. The entrance camera had captured her arriving at 7:04. After that, nothing. The stairwell camera and the lower level camera had both stopped recording at 6:58. 6 minutes before she arrived, they resumed at 7:42. 38 minutes of footage gone. "Malfunction?" Marco asked, already knowing the answer. "Professional wipe." Sal set a single printed page on the table, a technical assessment from a man Marco paid to understand these things. Not a glitch, not a power surge. Deliberate remote access, executed cleanly. Someone who knew the system, knew the timing, and knew she was coming. Marco read the page without expression. Then he set it down. "Who manages the garage system?" "City contract. I renewed 14 months ago." Sal paused, the specific pause of someone about to say something that changes the weight of a conversation. The contract approval went through the Deputy Commissioner's office. The name sat in the air between them. Deputy Commissioner Aldo Rain. Marco knew the name. Everyone in San Corvo knew the name. Rainey was the kind of official who appeared at ribbon cuttings and police graduations and community safety forums, who spoke in the measured cadences of a man who had practiced sounding trustworthy until it became involuntary. He had championed the city's new public safety task force 18 months ago, had stood at a podium and talked about accountability, about modernizing the department, about making sure that cases were handled efficiently and resources weren't wasted on investigations that went nowhere. Efficiently, Marco said quietly. He personally reviewed the task force's case closure metrics, Sal continued. Julia's missing persons report fell under their jurisdiction. Rain's office received a copy of the case summary the same day it was opened. Another pause. It was closed 2 days later. The detective who signed off on it transferred to a desk position in the traffic division 3 weeks after that. Pay increase included. Marco was quiet for a long moment. The corruption wasn't hovering around the edges of this. It wasn't a parallel story running alongside the investigation into Julia's disappearance. It was the investigation. The task force that closed the case, the detective who signed his name to it, the city contract that governed the cameras, the office that approved the contract, all of it traced back to the same man. But Rain hadn't just failed to find Julia. He had actively ensured she stayed unfound, which meant he knew exactly where she was. "Does he know we're looking?" Marco asked. "Not yet." "Keep it that way." Marco stood, which in the restaurant's quiet language meant the meeting was over. Then he stopped. Pull everything on Rain, not just the public record, everything. What he owns, who he owes, what he's afraid of. A beat. And find out what Julia's job actually involved, specifically. I want to know what she was working on in the 3 months before she disappeared. Sal left. Marco stood at the window, looking out at the street below, at the ordinary morning traffic of a city that had no idea what was moving underneath it. Someone had bought a closed case file and called it safety. Someone had wiped 38 minutes of footage and called it a malfunction. Someone had built a careful, professional silence around a young woman and trusted that the silence would hold. They had trusted wrong. Marco went to Rosa alone. No Sal. No car with tinted windows parked conspicuously at the curb. He took a cab to the end of her street and walked the last block like any other man in a neighborhood like this. Unhurried, unremarkable, hands in his coat pockets. The last thing he needed was to make Rosa Mancini a visible point of interest to anyone who might be watching. She opened the door before he knocked. She had been expecting him, he realized. Not today specifically. But she had known he would come back with questions, and she had been sitting with the decision of how much to answer for longer than their first meeting. She brought coffee without asking. He sat at her kitchen table, in the chair that faced the door, because some habits don't turn off. The kitchen was small and immaculate. A row of African violets on the windowsill. A photograph of Julia on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like the Sicilian coast. Julia was maybe 19 in the picture, laughing at something outside the frame, unguarded in the way young people are before the world teaches them to be careful. Marco looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Rosa. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer it completely this time." Rosa set her coffee cup down. The gesture was precise, deliberate, not defensive. More like a woman setting down something heavy she had been carrying for a while. "She came to me," Rosa said, 3 weeks before she disappeared. Marco waited. She was frightened. Rosa said the word carefully, like she was still measuring it against her memory of Julia's face that night. Not the way she used to get frightened when she was young, loud, reactive. This was different. This was quiet. The kind of frightened that means someone has already thought through what they're afraid of, and it didn't get smaller when they looked at it directly. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan, set a small object on the table between them. A USB drive. Black, unremarkable, the kind sold in packs of 5 at any pharmacy. A piece of white tape on one side with 2 words written in Julia's handwriting. Don't look. She asked me to hide it, Rosa said. Told me not to ask questions about it, not to look at what was on it. Just keep it somewhere safe and don't tell anyone. A pause. Oh, I didn't look. I just hid it. In the lining of my winter coat, the one I don't wear until November. I thought... She stopped. I thought she was being dramatic. I thought it was something that would resolve itself and she'd come pick it up in a few weeks and explain, and we'd probably argue about the fact that she'd frightened me. Her voice stayed level, but only just. She didn't come pick it up. Marco took the drive without touching the tape. He turned it over once, then set it down. I had it looked at this morning, he said. Rosa's eyes came up sharply. Before I came here, I had someone I trust examine it. He met her gaze directly. I needed to know what we were dealing with before I sat across from you again. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Tell me, Rosa said. Marco told her. The drive contained 14 months of financial records and internal communications, contracts routed through city infrastructure, the same planning division where Julia worked, that on paper funded public works projects and on reality funded something else entirely. A network, organized, protected, and operational for at least 4 years, moving people through the city using systems that Julia's office managed and that Rainey's department had jurisdiction to inspect and, when necessary, quietly clear. 2 other officials appeared in the communications alongside Rain, both in positions that gave them exactly the access the network required. All 3 names appeared across multiple transactions, multiple communications, multiple falsified closures on cases that should never have been closed. Julia hadn't stumbled onto a financial irregularity. She had stumbled onto the architecture of something designed to be invisible, and she had been careful enough or frightened enough to document it before they noticed her noticing. They had noticed anyway. Rosa sat very still across the table. Her hands were flat on the surface in front of her, pressed down with a steadiness that looked like it was costing her something. They didn't take her because she was in the way, she said. Not a question. No, Marco said. They took her because she was a threat. Rosa closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. Then she's still alive, she said. If they just wanted her gone, she'd be gone. They're keeping her somewhere because they don't know yet how much other people know. They're waiting to see if the drive surfaces. But she looked at Marco with an expression he recognized because he had worn it himself, in rooms not unlike this one, when the shape of a dangerous situation finally became clear. Which means the moment they feel safe, she stops being useful. Marco said nothing, because she was right, and they both knew it, and some truths don't require confirmation. He picked up the USB drive and put it in his coat pocket. Don't open the door for anyone you don't recognize, he said. Don't use your phone to call anyone connected to Julia. Don't vary your routine in any way that looks like preparation. Rosa nodded once. Marco stood to leave. At the kitchen doorway he stopped, the way he had at the restaurant window, looking at something that required a moment of stillness before moving forward. She was brave, he said. Your granddaughter. What she did took courage. Most people don't have. Rosa looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. At Julia, 19 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. I know, she said quietly. She always was. Marco left. The door closed softly behind him. Outside, the street was ordinary and unhurried, the city indifferent as ever. But in his coat pocket, the weight of a small USB drive had just changed the shape of everything. Because now it wasn't just about finding Julia. It was about finding her before Raina figured out that someone already had. The meeting happened at 10 the following morning in the back room of a dry cleaning business on Parade Street that Marco had owned for 11 years and never once used for dry cleaning. 4 men sat around a table that had witnessed decisions of significant consequence. Sal was there. So was Nico Barra, who managed Marco's interests on the north side and had been doing so long enough to have opinions that Marco respected even when he disagreed with them. And there was Farron, Marco's lawyer, not the public one who handled the legitimate businesses, but the other one, the quiet one whose name didn't appear on letterheads. Marco let them speak first. He always did. Nico went first, because Nico always did. He was direct in the manner of a man who had learned that softening difficult things only extended the discomfort without reducing it. Reina has federal connections, he said. Not aspirational ones, operational ones. 2 of the names on that drive have DOJ relationships that go back 8 years. You move against him, you're not kicking a city official. You're kicking something with reach that extends well outside this city. And when something like that kicks back... He paused. It doesn't aim carefully. Farron spoke next, quieter, with the measured cadence of a man whose job was to calculate exposure. Our arrangement with the city has survived because it has been mutually convenient, he said. Rain's office is part of that architecture whether we interact with him directly or not. You dismantle him publicly, you destabilize agreements that have taken years to balance. The people those agreements are with will not be understanding about the reason. Sal said nothing for a moment. Then, because he was Sal and loyalty didn't mean silence, he said, "They're not wrong, Marco." The room waited. Marco looked at the table, not at any of them, at the table, at the grain of the wood. The way a man looks at something neutral when he's thinking through something that isn't. The calculation was not complicated. He understood it clearly. Going after Rainey meant accepting exposure he had spent decades carefully avoiding. It meant pulling on a thread that was woven through structures his own operation depended on. It meant a war conducted not with street-level violence, which he understood and could manage, but with the particular brutality of institutions. Investigations, pressure applied through channels, the slow administrative suffocation that left no visible marks. He understood all of it. He thought about Rosa's hands on the table. Flat, pressed down, costing her something to hold steady. He thought about the 4 words he had already given. And he thought about a woman he hadn't helped 30 years ago and a winter she hadn't survived. "We move forward," he said. No elaboration, no debate. The meeting was over. Rainey's message arrived at 11:40 that night. Sal called, and Marco knew from the first syllable that something had happened. Sal was not a man who lost composure. The fact that his voice was careful in the specific way of someone controlling it deliberately told Marco everything before the words did. Peter Sousa was 26 years old. He ran a small numbers operation on the east side that operated under Marco's umbrella. Nothing significant, a modest living, a young man who had grown up in the neighborhood and known Marco's people since childhood. He was not involved in the search for Julia. He was not involved in anything that touched Rainey, and he was just visible, and known, and easy to reach. They found him outside his apartment building. He was alive. That was deliberate, too, Marco understood, because a body created the wrong kind of attention. But the message written in what had been done to him was legible to anyone who knew how to read it. "We know you're asking questions. This is what asking costs." Marco stood in his kitchen for a long time after Sal's call ended. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the city hummed its indifferent hum. He thought about Peter, 26 years old, who had nothing to do with any of this. He thought about Julia, 32 years old, sitting somewhere in this city waiting to find out if anyone was coming. Then he picked up his phone and called Sal back. "How fast can we move?" he said. "As fast as you want. Then we're done waiting." Rain had made a mistake. It wasn't the violence itself. Men in his position had used that instrument before and would again. It was the target. Because Peter Sousa had nothing to do with Giulia Mancini, and that was precisely the point Rainey intended to make, that Marco's reach could be touched anywhere, that no one was safe simply because they were innocent. What Rain had not understood, what men who operated from behind desks and federal connections rarely understood, was that there is a particular kind of clarity that comes from being attacked through someone who deserved none of it. It doesn't produce hesitation, it eliminates it. Every remaining question about how far to go, every residual calculation about cost and exposure and the wisdom of restraint simply burns away. Marco had been weighing things before that phone call, and he wasn't weighing anything after it. He visited Peter at the hospital in the morning. He stayed 12 minutes, said very little, and left an envelope with the nurse at the desk that would cover everything not covered by anything else. Then he walked to his car, sat in it for a moment with the engine off, and made a decision that had the specific quality of finality. Not dramatic, not announced, just settled. The way a door sounds when it locks from the inside. Then he drove to Rosa's. She opened the door and looked at his face and said nothing. Just stepped aside to let him in. They sat at the kitchen table again. The African violets on the windowsill, Giulia laughing on the refrigerator. The same kitchen, the same chairs, but something in the air was different this time, heavier, closer, in the feeling of a storm that has been building offshore finally making landfall. Marco told her everything, not a managed version, not the careful edited briefing he might have given someone else. All of it, the parking garage, the wiped cameras, the detective who took a promotion to stop asking questions, Rain's name at the center of it, the USB drive and what it contained, the network it documented, the 4 years it had been operating, the infrastructure it had used. And then he told her about Peter, about the message, about what it meant that Rain had sent it. Rosa listened without interrupting. She held her coffee cup but didn't drink from it. Her face moved through things. He could see it, the information landing, each piece finding its place in an architecture she had been building in the dark for 11 days without enough material to complete it. Now she had the complete picture. Now she could see the whole shape of what had been done and why and by whom. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Rosa set her cup down, looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up, and what was in her face was not what Marco had expected. He had prepared quietly for grief, for the particular devastation of a grandmother learning that her granddaughter had been targeted deliberately, specifically, because she had been brave enough to document something powerful people wanted invisible. But Rosa Mancini did not look devastated. She looked like someone who had just been handed the last piece of information they needed to stop being afraid and start being certain. She found it at work, Rosa said. Not a question. Processing aloud. Yes. She documented it, copied it, brought it to me because she trusted me to keep it safe and didn't want to put anyone else at risk. A pause. Something moving through her eyes that Marco recognized as the specific pain of understanding a loved one's last decisions clearly for the first time. She was protecting people, even then, even when she was frightened. Yes, Marco said again, because it was true and it deserved the simple weight of confirmation. Rosa was quiet for another moment. Her hands were on the table, flat, still. The same hands that had shaken over a photograph 11 days ago were motionless now. I'm pressed against the wood with a steadiness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with decision. She raised her eyes to his. Then finish it, she said. 2 words. Quiet as a closing door. Absolute as anything Marco had ever heard in any room in any meeting in 54 years of navigating a world that ran on the currency of conviction. He held her gaze for a moment. This woman who had pressed her dress and gripped her cane and walked into the most dangerous restaurant in San Corvo because every sanctioned door had closed in her face. This woman who had hidden a USB drive in the lining of a winter coat and waited alone without knowing if anyone would ever come. This woman who had not collapsed under the weight of what he'd just told her but had straightened beneath it, but the way certain materials do under pressure, not breaking, densifying. Marco nodded. "I'll bring her home," he said. It was the first promise he had made since Rosa sat down across from him. He made it deliberately, with full knowledge of what it cost to say it and full intention of paying that cost. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, at Julia, 19, laughing at something outside the frame. "She always hated being kept waiting," Rosa said quietly. It was the closest thing to a smile that the kitchen had seen in 11 days. Marco stood, buttoned his coat, and walked to the door. Behind him, Rosa sat at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on her granddaughter's photograph, holding the particular stillness of someone who has handed a terrible weight to someone they've decided to trust. Outside, the city was gray and indifferent, and completely unaware of what was about to move through it. Marco called Sal before he reached the car. "Tonight," he said. "We move tonight." Marco had learned something early in his life that most people learn too late, if at all. The difference between force and precision. Force was loud and expensive and left debris that required management for years afterward. Precision was quiet, economical, and permanent. Force announced itself. Precision was already finished before anyone realized it had begun. What happened over the next 18 hours was precision. It started not with movement, but with information. Deployed to the right people in the right sequence like a key turned in a series of locks. Sal had spent the previous 72 hours building a map. Not of locations, but of dependencies. Every person in Rain's protection structure had something they valued more than their loyalty to him. A pension, a family arrangement that required continued employment, a separate exposure that Rain himself was holding over them as insurance. Sal had found all of it. Marco had read all of it, and now, beginning at 7 in the evening and moving through the night in carefully timed intervals, the map was used. A phone call to a mid-level administrator in the contracts office, made by a voice the administrator recognized and feared, with a specific document attached that made continued silence more costly than cooperation. A visit to the detective who had closed Julia's case, during which nothing was threatened and nothing needed to be. The contents of an envelope left on his kitchen table communicated everything without a word spoken. A message conveyed through 3 intermediaries to the second official named on the USB drive, a man whose particular exposure was financial and whose appetite for self-preservation was, Marco had correctly calculated, stronger than his loyalty to Rain. That man made a call at 11:14 that night to a number Marco had provided. The number belonged to Curtis Hale. Hale was a federal investigator, not based in San Corvo, not connected to any structure Rain touched, not susceptible to the kind of pressure that had kept the local apparatus cooperative for 4 years. Marco had cultivated the relationship carefully over a decade, never calling it in, treating it as the kind of resource you held in reserve precisely because the moment you used it, it could only be used once. He had been waiting for something that warranted it. He had found it. Hale received the call, the USB drive, delivered by courier at midnight, and a precise summary of the documentation with source verification attached. He was, Marco had always assessed, a man who recognized the shape of something real when it was placed in front of him. He made 3 calls of his own before 1 in the morning. By 2, a federal warrant was in motion through a jurisdiction that Rain had no relationship with and no leverage over. Julia was found at 4:17 in the morning, a warehouse facility on the city's eastern industrial edge. I registered to a logistics company that existed on paper and nowhere else, The lease routed through a subsidiary that traced back, with patience and the right access, to a contract approved 18 months ago by the Deputy Commissioner's office. She had been held in a climate-controlled interior room, guarded but not heavily. Rainey had been confident in his invisibility, and confidence of that kind produces complacency. The men Marco sent were 4 in number. The operation lasted 11 minutes. There was no unnecessary anything, no announcements, no confrontation beyond what the situation required, nothing that would complicate what came next. Julia Mancini was alive, dehydrated, exhausted in the deep way of someone who had been surviving on controlled fear for nearly 2 weeks. But her eyes, when the door opened, were clear. And she had not given up. She had been waiting the way Rosa had raised her to wait, not passively, but with the tight, coiled patience of someone who had decided they were going to survive this and had simply been waiting for the conditions to make that possible. Sal called Marco at 4:22. "She's out." Marco was standing at his apartment window. The city below was dark and quiet, the stillness of the hours before dawn when San Corvo briefly forgot what it was. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 moment, then opened them. Take her to the safe house. Doctor first. Then call Rosa. Raina's world came apart in the way that carefully constructed things come apart when the foundation is removed. Suddenly, and all at once. The federal warrant executed at 6 in the morning. By 7, the 2 of the 3 officials named on the drive had retained separate lawyers, which meant they had already made the calculation that cooperation served them better than solidarity. By 9, Rain's federal connections, the ones Nico had warned Marco about, had quietly declined to intervene because the documentation was too clean and the exposure too complete, and there was nothing in it for them to absorb the damage. By noon, the story was outside the city entirely. Hale had ensured that. The kind of outside that meant it couldn't be locally managed, locally pressured, locally buried. San Corvo shook in the particular way cities shake when something they believed was solid turns out to have been hollow all along. Not with noise, not immediately, with the stunned, recalibrating silence of people revising everything they thought they understood about who had been keeping them safe and what that safety had actually cost. The case that had been closed in 4 days was reopened. The detective who had signed off on it was suspended pending investigation. The task force Rain had championed was dissolved by the end of the week, its case files pulled for federal review. 4 years of falsified closures, 4 years of infrastructure used as cover, 4 years of people who had fallen into the network's path and been disappeared into case files that said they'd left on their own, that they had histories, that the evidence didn't support further investigation. Julia had found it, documented it, hidden it in a cedar-handled purse belonging to a 78-year-old woman who had pressed her dress and walked into the wrong restaurant. The city gave it all up. It had no choice. The right person had finally decided to look. Marco didn't go to the safe house. He had considered it briefly in the way you consider things you know you won't do. It wasn't his reunion to attend. He had played his part in making it possible, and that was enough, more than enough. More than he had expected to feel when he gave 4 words to a man standing behind his left shoulder 11 days ago in a restaurant that smelled of garlic and cigarette smoke and the particular tension of a room that had just witnessed something it didn't have a category for. He sent Sal with a car, and he made sure the doctor was good and the safe house was warm and that there was food, real food, the kind that required someone who knew what they were doing, not whatever passed for a meal in a facility designed for logistics rather than living. He made sure Rosa had a number to call if she needed anything, and that the number would be answered regardless of the hour. Then he went back to the restaurant and sat in his booth and drank coffee that went cold and didn't particularly mind. The reunion happened the way the most important things happen, quietly, without an audience, in a room that held it privately, and kept it there. Rosa was already at the safe house when Sal brought Julia in. She had been sitting in a chair by the window, back straight, hands folded, the way she had been sitting in rooms and waiting for things her entire life. When the door opened, she stood, and then she stopped standing because her legs made a different decision, and Sal, who was not a sentimental man by any measure, found somewhere else to be for the next several minutes. What passed between them in that room belonged to them. What could be observed, briefly and from a distance, was this. Rosa held her granddaughter the way she must have held her when Julia was 7 years old, and the world had just taken her mother, and everything felt like it was falling. Not carefully, not with the tentativeness of people afraid to damage something fragile. Completely. The way you hold something you came close to losing and haven't yet finished understanding that you didn't. Julia was thinner. Her eyes carried the particular weight of someone who had spent 2 weeks in a small room with nothing but their own thoughts and the specific discipline of deciding, each morning, to still be there in the evening. She would carry some version of that weight for a long time. Rosa knew it. Julia knew it. Neither of them said it, because some things are understood between people who have survived together without needing to be named. They stayed at the safe house for 3 days. Sal checked in. The doctor came twice. Slowly, incrementally, the way color returns to something that has been kept from light, Julia came back to herself. On the 4th day, Rosa asked Sal to take her somewhere. She walked into the restaurant alone. The room settled into its familiar stillness, and the men at the tables tracked her movement with the same attention as the first time. But something in it was different now. Not wariness, something closer to recognition. She walked past the first table, the second, the third. She sat down across from Marco. He had been expecting her, in the same way she had expected him to come back with questions. They were, he had come to understand, people who kept their word in the particular way of those who have had enough taken from them to understand exactly what it costs. He didn't speak. He waited. Rosa opened her purse, set something on the table between them. It was small. A photograph, older than the one she had placed on this table 11 days ago, worn at the edges, the color faded in the particular way of pictures that have been handled often, carried close, might taken out and looked at, and put carefully back. It showed a young woman, maybe 30, dark-haired, standing in a garden beside an older woman whose posture was unmistakable even in the faded light. Rosa and Julia. Years ago. Before the fear, before the dark past, Julia had clawed her way back from, before any of it. Just 2 women in a garden, squinting into summer light, holding each other by the arm. On the back, in Rosa's handwriting, 4 words. She came home. Thank you. Marco looked at the photograph for a long time. At the garden, at the summer light. At the 2 women holding each other in the uncomplicated way of people who don't yet know what's coming and are simply, in that moment, together. Then he looked at Rosa. She was watching him with the steady, but clear eyes of a woman who had pressed her dress and walked through an impossible door and come out the other side with what she came for. No performance in it, no debt being discharged. Just one person looking at another across a table in a city that was still reckoning with what it had allowed, and between them something that had no clean name but didn't need one. Marco reached across the table and set the photograph back in front of her. "Keep it," he said. Rosa looked at him a moment longer. Then she picked up the photograph, held it briefly with both hands, and placed it back in her purse with the particular care of someone returning something precious to where it belongs. Outside, San Corvo carried on. The traffic moved. The morning opened up gray and ordinary over streets that had no idea what had passed through them. And the city had given everything up and was already beginning to forget, the way cities do, settling back into its rhythms with the comfortable amnesia of something large and indifferent. But in the back booth of a restaurant on a street the city overlooked, Two people sat across a table that had now held two impossible conversations, and between them was the particular silence of something completed. Not simply finished, but resolved, the way a long note resolves when it finally finds its chord. Marco lifted his coffee. Rosa lifted hers. Neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. The city moved outside the window. The morning carried on, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, Marco Ferri sat in his booth and felt the specific quiet of a man who had stood at the right window, and this time, finally, had not looked away.